The engine's design demanded everything from materials that could shrug off weeks of continuous furious heat, and from an assembly line that could turn prototypes into thousands of equal units. Those demands arrived as deadlines from the military, which wore the blunt face of urgency and offered little patience for nuance. The early cycles were faithful to a lesson familiar to any engineer. Failure revealed the nature of the problem. An endurance test would begin under wine and smoke, the dynamometer recording curves and temperature gradients that read like a patient's vitals. At first, the engine would sing, smooth, full. Then a bearing would begin to run warmer. A plume of oil mist might appear around a crankcase seam. The team would shut it down, send in the inspectorial hands, and discover a hairline crack along a valve guide, an improperly heat-treated crank pen, a baffling gap that let hot air smear its path across a piston head. The workshop translated every broken part into a story, where the casting had cooled too fast, where a machinist's tool, worn by hundreds of cuts, had left a microscopic ridge that later became a heat concentrator. Sometimes the cause was human fatigue, a night shift worker who had not been given the margin for rest necessary to keep the process immaculate. Brackett hated to place blame without learning. For him, a failure was a tutor that required a lesson written down and taught back. The technical challenges had names and metaphors for the general reader. The engine's twin-row layout gave it muscle but choked the flow of cooling air to the rear cylinders. They sat in the lee of the front row, like houses in the shadow of taller buildings. Thermal gradients became an enemy, warping cylinder liners and warping the timing of valves. Oil that served to lubricate could turn traitor when it broke into a film too thin to buffer hot metal. Seals, once trusted, would bleed and invite overheating. The engine required a supercharging system, a way of forcing more air into the cylinders to maintain power at altitude. In practice, that meant adding equipment that itself generated heat and required ducting and control. The turbo supercharger captured exhaust energy to spin a compressor, an ingenious reclaiming of wasted breath. But it behaved like a new organism attached to the engine, introducing immediate problems of its own: back pressure, temperature management, and the need for reliable materials that would not crumble under turbo speeds. Brackett and his small circle spoke of alloys as if they were temperamental apprentices. Aluminum was king of lightness, but aluminum that had not been worked, doped, and aged properly would creep, sagging under constant heat and load. Steel and its chromium and nickel companions added strength where needed, but at the cost of weight. Oil that served to lubricate could turn traitor when it broke into a film too thin to buffer hot metal. Seals, once trusted, would bleed and invite overheating. The engine required a supercharging system, a way of forcing more air into the cylinders to maintain power at altitude. In practice, that meant adding equipment that itself generated heat and required ducting and control. The turbo supercharger captured exhaust energy to spin a compressor, an ingenious reclaiming of wasted breath. But it behaved like a new organism attached to the engine, introducing immediate problems of its own: back pressure, temperature management, and the need for reliable materials that would not crumble under turbo speeds. Brackett and his small circle spoke of alloys as if they were temperamental apprentices. Aluminum was king of lightness, but aluminum that had not been worked, doped, and aged properly would creep, sagging under constant heat and load. Steel and its chromium and nickel companions added strength where needed, but at the cost of weight. Brackett's lab became a crucible of compromise. How much weight could they accept for a given gain in strength? What hardness would allow a valve seat to hold against blow-by? Which casting method reduced porosity to an acceptable minimum? Each choice had downstream consequences, measured not only in strength, but in repairability, manufacturability, and the lives of those who would maintain the engines in the field. On the floor, the human detail unfolded like a counterpoint. Samuel Ortiz was 22, hands swift and calloused, an immigrant son who had learned the language of the factory faster than English. He had the single-mindedness of someone who believed that if you could make a crankshaft true to within thousandths of an inch, you could then place the world back on its axis. Ortiz kept a small photograph near his lathe, a woman with a braid and a child. Letters came from home in the evenings, on stationery that smelled faintly of laundry soap. They braided small domestic normalities into the larger roar. There were older men with soot-scarred sleeves who had worked in plants since before the war, who could set a valve by ear and measure the color of oil with their thumb. Between these men and Brackett's readings of metal and figures, a culture of craft emerged. Rituals of coffee at dawn, the sharing of a sandwich under fluorescent light, a certain practical humor. Industrial labor produced patterns of intimacy as surely as it produced parts. Yet the machine's temperament frustrated the best of them. At one test cell, after an early failure that had singed a bearing and blackened an otherwise successful run, Brackett sat alone under a shed of piping and made a list, a terse, ciphered ledger of the chain linking a loose baffle to a swollen piston crown. He ran his hand along the list as if to smooth out the thought into motion. There was a kind of moral economy to these evenings. A decision on the shop floor could ripple into a mission that deprived an entire town of power, or into a flight that carried men to safety. Brackett did not imagine that his hand shaped geopolitical outcomes. He simply accepted that the quality of his work would manifest itself in the most intimate and the most terrible ways. Institutional pressure was a weather system in itself. The military wanted engines, and more of them, by dates printed in terse orders. Production targets that arrived as quantities and delivery weeks masked the bloodied edges of actual work. Supply chains that required bronzed castings out of a single foundry. Rush orders for bearings that could not be reworked on demand. And the human capacity to turn out uniform parts across multiple shifts. Management meetings were cramped with engineers who translated abstract demands into lists for the floor. The tone of these gatherings was not always blunt. Sometimes it was a brittle politeness that attempted to hide fear. At other times, the presence of colonels in hard hats made the engineers feel both defended and corralled, supported by funding, urged by an impatient calendar. One early breakthrough arrived in the half-light between shifts. The team had been fighting a mystery, rear cylinders running hotter than could be explained by simple airflow. Several corrective measures had been tried: reshaped baffles, altered fin profiles, an alternate grade of oil, and each brought only marginal improvement. Brackett asked for a small experiment, an otherwise minor alteration in the routing of the ducting that led around the twin rows. The change was simple and cheap, an adjusted plate that redirected a sliver more air to the rear. The next run was cautious and then sustained, and then, to the surprise of technicians who had been living under the gravity of failure, clean. Temperature stabilized. Bearings ran cool. The run lasted hours instead of minutes. It was a breakthrough that carried with it something almost banal in its mien. Not a single miracle, but the slow accretion of knowledge. Brackett scribbled a note, short, clinical, that read less like triumph than like a record for the future man who would stand in the same cell. The men drank coffee in the still-warm test house and laughed with a tired, honest noise that acknowledged survival in the face of stubborn metal. Samuel Ortiz, who had tightened the ducting by hand, kept his hands on his knees for a long time after the others left, as if he feared the world might resume its prior shape without him. The cycles of improvement and new vexation continued. Once the cooling issue eased, another liminal problem appeared: carburation in high-altitude conditions. The supercharger, designed to make up for thin air, strained to feed a hungry set of cylinders. The team had to decide between increasing supercharger boost, risky for its effect on internal temperatures, or adapting the engine internals to accept leaner mixtures. Brackett and the aerodynamics men exchanged feverish diagrams. They tested alternative compression ratios, experimented with spark timing, and adjusted manifold geometry. Each alteration required balancing combustion temperature against power and structural integrity. To the layman, the talk might have seemed arcane. To those in the room, it was the arithmetic of survival. Parallel to the benchwork, the factory itself swelled. Production lines once meant for smaller engines expanded into cathedrals of tooling. Floors laid with rails, cranes that moved blocks like living hymns, jigs that promised uniformity, and teams trained to make identical parts by rote. The scale required a new discipline of quality control. Inspectors armed with gauges, and gauges themselves, wore expressions of quiet terror. Here again, the human cost showed its face. Men who had been hand-fitting parts for decades found themselves replaced by younger workers taught to trust a gauge more than their seasoned eye. The cycles of improvement and new vexation continued. Once the cooling issue eased, another liminal problem appeared: carburation in high-altitude conditions. The supercharger, designed to make up for thin air, strained to feed a hungry set of cylinders. The team had to decide between increasing supercharger boost, risky for its effect on internal temperatures, or adapting the engine internals to accept leaner mixtures. Brackett and the aerodynamics men exchanged feverish diagrams. They tested alternative compression ratios, experimented with spark timing, and adjusted manifold geometry. Each alteration required balancing combustion temperature against power and structural integrity. To the layman, the talk might have seemed arcane. To those in the room, it was the arithmetic of survival. Parallel to the benchwork, the factory itself swelled. Production lines once meant for smaller engines expanded into cathedrals of tooling. Floors laid with rails, cranes that moved blocks like living hymns, jigs that promised uniformity, and teams trained to make identical parts by rote. The scale required a new discipline of quality control. Inspectors armed with gauges, and gauges themselves, wore expressions of quiet terror. Here again, the human cost showed its face. Men who had been hand-fitting parts for decades found themselves replaced by younger workers taught to trust a gauge more than their seasoned eye. There were strikes of resentment and also acts of solidarity. An older machinist staying an extra hour to teach a younger man how to dress a bearing surface with the thumb and small file. The plant's hum created a different sort of music. The clatter of presses, the whisper of conveyors, the measured cadence of pneumatic tools. For the veterans, it was the heartbeat of a new cathedral. On a gray morning when clouds hung like damp curtains, the lead test crew prepared the engine for an endurance trial that the company called pivotal. They had redesigned the cylinder head geometry and altered the heat treatment of key parts. The stands were stripped and rebuilt to accommodate instrumentation that could trace combustion pressure across cycles. The pilot for the test run, a short, stoic flight engineer named Jack Simmons, insisted on watching the start sequence in person. He had flown earlier prototypes and knew the sound of a motor that would not betray them within the first hour. A small crowd packed the gallery above the test cell. Men in grease-stained jackets and officials in pressed uniforms who watched with the nervous attention of people at a wake. When they fired up, the engine began in that animal way engines do: a cough, a settling, and then a voice. The sound built carefully into a tone that filled the cell and crept along the corridor. Brackett stood with his palm against the cold metal of a control post and felt the vibration as if he were holding another man's wrist. The dials slid into ranges that had been pre-assigned as acceptable. Minutes lengthened like small triumphs. An hour passed. The audience in the gallery stopped their small conversations and listened. 2 hours. The rhythm held. By 3 hours, some of the men had unclenched. By 5 hours, when the upper surface temperature rose and steadied at a point they had learned to accept, there were bursts of relieved exhalation. The run lasted longer than any before it. It was not perfect. Oil sap collected in a seam and required a quick adjustment. But it did not fail in the manner of earlier prototypes. When the team shut it down, the silence felt heavy, not with gloom, but with the weight of consequence. Brackett walked down the catwalk and clapped Ortiz on the shoulder. They did not celebrate in a way that would have blurred into triumph. They marked the occasion with a professional nod and the exchange of notes on what to change next. That night in the shop, the men repaired a small leak and rewired an oil pump, counting things that would matter under the green fire of a combat overload. Word of that endurance run did not stay within the walls of the plant. It traveled through telegrams and conference calls to officers tasked with assembling squadrons and planning missions. Suddenly, the bomber, for which the engine was meant, had its horizons extended in technical memoranda and in the mental maps of planners. Longer loiter times, heavier bomb loads, flights that could reach further islands and return on schedules once deemed impossible. The abstract numbers became tangible. The geography of the Pacific was a different place when a bomber could fly an hour longer or ascend higher and escape some interceptors. Those changes would, in time, reshape operations, opening tactical possibilities that some men saw as salvation and others as a new level of moral difficulty. Not everyone in the plant welcomed the spread of that news. There was a quiet, private worry among machinists about the tempo of production that would follow. Faster delivery meant more shifts, means more acres of cabins lit at night and more weary hands. Brackett heard these complaints and felt them almost as a matter of personal responsibility. He argued in meetings that schedules must be realistic, that spare time for inspection could not be a casualty of urgency. At the same time, he understood the military's imperatives. He had watched maps and read briefings and known what the commanders wanted to achieve. His inner conflict shaped a steady resolve to produce engines that minimized risk, to resist the temptation to allow production speed to outpace quality. While the technical team cheered a sustained test run, the larger consequences of success were already stirring in operational circles. Pilots like Eddie Allen took newly fitted bombers on test hops that felt like trials of a different order. The machine now had the promise of range, and with range came responsibility. Eddie, a man who liked his jokes dry and his pre-flight checks tedious, felt the engine's new reliability as a quiet permission. He could plan flights with a confidence never available before. The crew learned to read the sound of the cowling like sailors read the sea. They understood that the engine's song would signal weather, altitude, and the quiet change of danger. Flights that had been theoretical on maps now took place under stars and over tracking lights, the turbo supercharger spinning as men watched gauges and thought of meals left cold at home. The civilian face of the war was present every time crews returned to airfields with engines that had been taxed and returned whole. There were briefings about missions, maps with routes scrawled in pencil, and the cold arithmetic of fuel and payloads. And then there were the less official conversations. A young mechanic asking a pilot what the sky felt like at 27,000 feet. An older flight engineer smoking in the tail with his boots still full of dust. The hum of victory elsewhere in the industrial complex had an odd intimacy on the airfield. Pilots would lay their hands on the engine nacelles and whisper something that was almost a benediction for a machine that had kept them alive. But the machine's improved performance was not a neutral instrument. It was an enabler. Brackett and his colleagues understood that an engine that allowed longer missions and heavier loads changed the scale and character of bombing campaigns. The same reliability that might spare a crew could also, in the hands of operational planners, magnify the reach of strategic bombing. Reports from the theater spoke in bald language. Targets reached, tonnage delivered, and they also began to catalog the grim arithmetic of civilian suffering from incendiary raids. Brackett read these dispatches with a complicated heart. He had not taken up a hammer in his life to deepen destruction, yet the geometry of his work and its consequences were bound together inescapably. In the quiet after test runs, he would sometimes unlace his boots and stare at a small program of a concert he had kept from years earlier, and think of the ways that skill and intent diverged when instruments slipped into the world. The first operational sweeps that used the new engines were cautious and demanded learning. Maintenance crews attached to squadrons learned new schedules for inspections, new lists for torquing and for measuring compression. The factories modified field manuals that explained, in blunt steps, the conditions under which an engine should be shut down or cooled. These procedural texts were a form of moral technology, too. They aimed to reduce harm by inserting rules. But rules could not eliminate accidents or the unforeseen. War, by its nature, involved unknowns. As the engines rolled into service, the tempo of war quickened in certain theaters. Longer-range missions allowed planners to conceive of strikes that were earlier impossible, and commanders adjusted tactics accordingly. The technological leap reshaped strategy, and strategy reshaped the lives of those who built, maintained, and flew these machines. In the factory, men told quiet stories of crews returning with engines that bore signs of their ordeals. Pitted exhausts, hairline cracks patched carefully by field crews, grease smeared on fabric maps. On the other end of the line, families of airmen waited and worried, knitting their anxieties into letters. Brackett received some of these letters forwarded through official channels. Short notes of thanks and desperate pleas, and he kept the folded pages in a top drawer, a reminder that his work had faces. The moral calculus shifted again when the bomber's range and load capacity made possible operations with grievously consequential outcomes. Planned incendiary raids were among the first to expand in scale when heavier bomb loads could fly farther with new engines. The strategic logic was argued in rooms filled with maps and figures. When the raids reached cities long beyond prior reach, entire populations were swept into the consequences. Reports spoke of vast areas consumed, of losses weighed in tons of property and in lives. Brackett and many of his peers read these dispatches with a sober gravity. They were engineers, trained in the rational analysis of systems, and they tried to comprehend their part in a system whose outputs were now measured in human catastrophe. In drunken hours after the shop closed, men in the plant would sometimes argue or sit in silence, wondering whether engineering had moral valence beyond its technical objectives. Still, the engines were an undeniable achievement in human problem-solving. The final breakthroughs that made mass production viable were less like a single lightning strike and more like a long procession of small victories. An improved heat treatment routine that stabilized alloy grain boundaries, an altered casting process that reduced hidden porosity, a revised lubrication circuit that buffered oil temperatures under sustained boost. Each had its names, dates, and testimonies from the men who carried them out. When assembled and tested, the mass-produced engines kept planes aloft at distances once only etched in theory. The factory's output rose, and with it, the speed of deliveries. The machine of war, greased at every hinge by human hands, turned with a force that neither the makers nor the military could fully disassemble into simple causes. In the months after the engines entered service in meaningful numbers, a maiden flight of a production bomber took place under a sky like hammered pewter. Pilots and crew performed a checklist honed by trials. The engines accelerated with a confident roar that swept into the air like a chorus. The bomber climbed and settled into a plane of flight that seemed remarkably calm given the forces at play. Brackett was not aboard, but he had been at the briefings and had taken the maps home for sleep-starved review. When the pilot radioed that all instruments looked good, there was a private, careful elation in shops and offices many miles away. The craft returned after its proving schedule with engines that had not betrayed them, a testament not only to design, but to the labor that had made every valve and stud precise. Operationally, the engine's success rippled outward. Squadrons could now fly further with heavier loads and prepare missions that previously had demanded staging or refueling stops. The military used that capacity to project force in crucial arcs across oceanic theaters. With this projection came concentrated moral weight. The same engine that earned pilots a chance for survival and allowed precision in some missions also provided planners the ability to carry out mass operations over urban centers with devastating efficiency. Histories of campaigns would later trace lines between technical capability and the scale of destruction realized. Engineers like Brackett did not always read those histories as simple narratives of guilt or pride. They read them as complicated accounts of causality and contingency, where human choices layered atop mechanical possibility determined outcomes. Within the plant, success made new demands. Quality control could not relax. A single negligent batch could spin a chain of failures at the front. Brackett instituted a practice, an extra inspection stage in which a senior machinist certified critical assemblies with a signature. The practice was small, bureaucratically simple, but it saved lives. Crews reported fewer overheating incidents in the field, and the plant's reputational risk fell. Brackett's signature on the inspection log was not a flourish. It was a moral statement. Outside the factory and the airfields, voices rose in public and private to argue about the conduct of the bombing campaigns. Some conceded that strategic bombing shortened wars by debilitating an enemy's war-making capacity. Others pointed to the civilian toll and asked whether ends justified means. Brackett read these debates with the same analytic mind he used for alloys. He could see arguments on both sides and found himself unsettled by the certainty with which some men spoke. To him, a machine was an instrument, not a moral agent. But instruments are used by people who have moral agency. The distinction did not make decision-making easier. As production continued and the war's momentum shifted, the engines earned a bittersweet reputation, praised for keeping crews alive and for enabling logistical possibilities, and implicated in large operations whose moral cost would be debated for decades. Brackett, who had once imagined his chief legacy would be a set of design notes available in an engineering library, found himself reflected in newspaper columns that credited factories with turning the tide. He read those columns with a sense of distance. The praise felt impersonal, and the critiques evaded the real texture of labor. What he cared about, in the end, was that a young mechanic could leave the floor and find that his work had been shaped by care, not by rushed indifference. The last months of that year were full of incremental but vital changes. Improved maintenance schedules for field crews, revised training manuals that explained the engine's quirks in plain language, and design tweaks that reduced the propensity for overheating at high boost settings. The machines were no longer brittle novices. They were complicated learners that, when treated with respect and tolerantly disciplined in production, repaid their makers with reliability. The people who ran the engines in the air, pilots, flight engineers, found a new accord with them. They learned to listen for warning tones, to trust certain gauges, and to ignore others. Crews developed rituals of pre-flight, a tap on the cowling, a whispered hope. The engines, in a way, absorbed human affect and returned it in service. Still, the narrative of success produced shadowed consequences. Those new operational possibilities had, in some cases, been used to carry out incendiary raids that erased neighborhoods and civilian lives. When reports of such raids arrived at the plant, the mood hardened into silence more often than debates. Men in overalls read the dispatches with the same uneasy concentration they gave a troublesome bearing, identifying cause and effect without simplifying the moral web. Brackett, who had once told his young apprentices that precision is mercy, now understood how precision could be converted into a tool of enormous destructive capacity when channeled by policy choices. The ethical texture of his craft had thickened. Recognition came in odd forms. A framed telegram arrived at the plant thanking them for the engine that had kept a bomber aloft and returned its crew. A later notice, more official, less intimate, announced that deliveries had been scheduled for new squadrons. Brackett pinned the telegram on a board and walked past it often, not because he needed to see it, but because he needed to feel the connections, to crews, to planners, to all the quiet people who sent and received letters pinned under telephone poles and in cots at distant bases. The machine had made those connections, and through them Brackett felt both pride and an ache he could not reconcile. When the war wound toward its close, talk began of obsolescence. The same ingenuity that had solved radial engine problems was already sketching the outlines of a future where rockets and jet turbines promised different regimes of speed and power. The factory did not close overnight. Production tapered as strategic priorities shifted. Men who had honed tolerances to desperate degrees found new factories or returned to civilian trades. Some took positions preserving the knowledge of alloy treatment and heat cycling in universities and in technical archives. Brackett himself grew quieter, his hair graying at the temples. He walked less often through the shop and more often through the plant's small museum, where a polished engine sat under lights, its polished fins glinting like a comet in a display case. He liked to stand before that engine and think of the forge and the men who had labored. The motif that had threaded through all of it, the rhythm of heart and hammer, felt particularly apt now. The machine had been a heart for a certain mechanical organism, and when the roar subsided, there was an aftermath of silence in which histories would be written. Museums would display engines and plaques would extol innovation. Veterans would tell of flights and friendships forged aloft. Towns would remember the nights of light and the days of rationing and the slow return to peacetime trades. Brackett accepted that the story of the engine would be collected in many hands: historians, technicians, and those who had suffered its indirect consequences. In the quiet hours of his later life, Brackett would sometimes walk with Samuel Ortiz, who had become a foreman with hands steady as a clock. They would go into the dim shop and stand before a lathe that had not seen use in years, and they would reminisce in the particular language of those who share a craft, about a valve seat that had finally kept, about a night when a broken part was welded by candlelight because a storm had cut power, about laughter over bad coffee. They did not always speak of the raids or the maps. When they did, the talk would be measured, as if the moral calculus were a delicate instrument that could be misread by heat. The engine's legacy was thus bifurcated. It was both testament to human ingenuity and a reminder of the ways technical capability can be placed into the hands of policies that amplify either protection or destruction. For Brackett and for those who had worked the benches, the pride lay in the craft, the precise filling of bearings, the patient tending of furnaces, the long nights that hardened into routine. For historians and ethicists, the story would become a chapter about the dual edge of technological success. Years later, visitors to the museum would press their faces against glass and look at the polished cylinders, the radial symmetry, and the delicate balance of fins and valves. School children would be told of horsepower and range. Veterans would stand with fingers tracing a contour and tell stories in low voices. Brackett's name, if mentioned at all, would appear on a small plaque or in an archival note about his procedural improvements. He accepted that scarcity of memory. He had not labored for fame. He had labored because a task required doing with exactness and care. The final scenes of that long arc were not cinematic explosions, but quiet attestations. An old test cell, shuttered, held the faint scent of once hot oil and singed gaskets. Birds nested where men had once hung instruments. In the museum, a small placard explained in sober text how engines had extended aircraft range and how that had, in turn, widened the theater of conflict. The language was balanced, technical accuracy paired with a humane note about consequences. Brackett, looking on once more in a brief visit, ran his fingers across the placard and felt the coolness of the glass. He no longer listened for the engine song. He listened for the residual hum in his knees, the echo of years when metal and human will had been braided together. He thought of the men, Ortiz, the older machinists, the pilots, of the coffee shared, and the small acts that had made the engines whole. He thought of the endurance run that had first proved a theory in living heat. He thought of the cities that had been touched by the capabilities his work had enabled. In those reflective hours, his pride was small and untrumpeted. It lived in the knowledge that their work had been competent, that they had tried, as much as any group of people can try, to make something reliable in a time that constantly pushed for faster and cheaper. The machine did not speak. It had no intention. Its songs were recorded in dials and in the worn edges of maintenance logs. The humans who had built it and flown with it continued, each in their way, to live with a memory that combined awe for what they had made and sober grief for what that making enabled. The forge, once a place of fevered nights, became a memory of artisan rhythms and a repository for techniques that would be taught to a new generation of engineers who might take similar tools in different directions. As the years continued, a younger scholar would visit the archives and leaf through Brackett's hand-drawn notes. She would read the careful diagrams, the lists of failed castings, the signed inspection logs, and she would see in them not only the technical steps, but the human patience that scaffolded them. When she wrote an article, she would call the engine a turning point in aeronautical engineering, a device that demonstrated how material science, manufacturing discipline, and the labor of thousands could together supply a strategic advantage. She would also note, with the balanced caution of a historian, that technological gains are never morally neutral. The engine lengthened range, altered tactics, and required a society to confront anew the contours of responsibility. Brackett's retirement did not end the conversations. In lecture halls, at small memorials, in the margins of histories, his name would surface sometimes with gratitude, sometimes with critique. Those who had known him told a different story, of a man who would not sacrifice quality for speed, who argued for adequate inspection time, who carried the memory of letters from anxious families as a private ledger. In that, his legacy was human-sized and honest. The museum engine, lit now with conservation lights and explained in brochures, remained a monument both to craft and to consequence. Visitors listened to audio recordings that terminated before entering into political argument, and then they stepped out into the plaza, where, on certain evenings, the sky drew lines of light from modern aircraft. The old engine, in its quiet display, kept its secrets in the curvature of its cooling fins and the thin, polished traces on valve faces where hands had adjusted tolerances one last time. Outside, the world continued to change. Jet-age turbines replaced the laborious art of finely tuned piston engines. The forge's fire cooled into institutional memory. Yet the echo remained, an emphasis on workmanship, the stubborn collection of data from failure, the moral need to weigh the outputs of one's craft. Brackett walked once more through the museum with a young engineer who had come to pay respects. They stood before the engine, and the young engineer asked, simply, what he thought had mattered most. Brackett paused, a thin smile crossing his lined face. "The care," he said, "and the listening. Listen to what the work tells you, and don't fool yourself into thinking that speed alone is virtue." He used the word listening not as sentiment, but as instruction, an ethic for a practice. The young engineer nodded, and together they stepped out into a sky that no longer smelled of burnt oil, but where the memory of that smell lingered like a lesson. There remained one last quiet image that seems to stitch the whole. A maintenance log, folded in yellow at the edges, found years later tucked into a library volume. In that log, Brackett had penciled with a practiced hand a short entry listing checks and small observations. At the bottom, he had written, in smaller letters, a line that read like a benediction more than a note. "Measure with care. Remember the faces." The line carried the essence of an artisan ethic that had undergirded a machine whose reach could be measured in miles and whose consequences would be measured in lives. The story of that engine, its men and women, its endurance runs, and the missions it enabled is not a tale of unalloyed triumph. It is a portrait of human ingenuity braided with moral complication, a record of small acts of craftsmanship that translated into vast operational capability, and of the sober responsibility that follows when technique becomes history. The forge and the test cell remain, in archives and memories, as places where people met material difficulty and, by persistent attention, made the world anew. Sometimes for saving, sometimes for ruin, always for consequence. The engine lasted long enough to change the map of war and short enough to be overtaken by newer technologies. In its wake, it left both inventiveness and regret, artifacts and ethics. The men who made it aged, the factory changed hands, and the museum preserved a single polished example so future generations might trace the curve of a cooling fin and remember that behind every advance in power, there were hands that had shaped it and faces that bore its consequences. In the weeks that followed, the young engineer, Rory, who had once felt the engine's scale in his palms and the warmth of its castings on his face, returned to the city with a new weight in his gait. He carried Brackett's words like a tool, not heavy to bear, but definitive in shape. He spoke of them at his bench, where apprentices leaned over blueprints stained with oil and coffee. He spoke of them in a seminar, where students asked for anecdotes and found beneath the anecdotes an ethic. Rory's days split between routine and remembrance. He learned, as others before him had learned, that memory is not a single object, but a discipline. There were calendars of maintenance and inspections to rewrite, standards committees that would tolerate argument only when it was precise, and veterans who tested every new method against the old ledger's cadence. The community that had formed around the engine, technicians, historians, families of those who had worked the test cells, did not move as one body. Some wanted a clean narrative of triumph. Another group wanted the machine contextualized as part of a harder moral ledger. Rory found himself mediating, translating language of bolts and tolerances into talk of consequence and of care. The museum, in its way, enjoined that conversation. Curators rotated exhibits to emphasize different aspects. One season, the focus was on material ingenuity, metallurgy, forging techniques, the peculiar tooling. Another leaned into social history, letters, petitions, the anonymous names in the margins of reports. Visitors shaped the message as much as the curators did. An old woman would linger at the engine's polished intake and speak of a son who never returned. A retired technician would point to a particular valve and say, "That one gave us trouble twice." Each utterance reframed the machine, and no single account could contain them all. Brackett, for his part, receded gradually into an archetype that suited hindsight. The elder whose care had been practical, not sentimental. The man whose neat handwriting had become an object of study. He did not covet such attention. In quieter months, he visited the museum alone, walked the perimeter, and watched teenagers take selfies that framed the engine as a backdrop to adolescence. He watched the sky, too, the same sky that had once been traversed by the machines his hands had helped to make, and felt the strangeness of standing between craft and consequence. Then, one autumn morning, the community convened for a memorial so modest it might have been overlooked. It was not an institutional pageant. It was a collection of faces and voices that knew the sound of the work. Rory spoke, not as an orator, but as someone who had listened and who had tried to put listening into action. He read the line from the yellowed log aloud. "Measure with care. Remember the faces." The sentence landed in the hall and held there, as if the room itself exhaled. Among the papers that surfaced after Brackett's death, he had kept few belongings: A life of work had a way of pruning itself. There were letters folded into envelopes, a tin of worn drafting pencils, and the log that had come to haunt museum brochures. In the margins of the log, in pencil and in the small, decisive strokes of someone who had written with a craftsman's certainty, Brackett had listed names. Not a roster of men, but a set of faces that had mattered to him. There were the initials of those who tested engines in blizzards, the mark of a woman who had supervised welding through blackout drills, a child's name scratched in the back, perhaps scribbled during a visit to the works years earlier. The list read like inventory and like prayer. When historians asked to examine the log, the debate sharpened. Some scholars insisted the artifact be treated as a technical primary source. Others insisted its human annotations demanded narrative attention. Rory, whose voice had become modestly influential, argued for both. He pushed for an exhibit that combined the hard facts, measurements, failure reports, with oral histories and family testimonials. He wanted visitors to see the valve faces and also to hear the names. The process of assembling such an exhibit proved instructive. Families donated photographs that showed hands stained with grease, badges faded to nearly nothing. Former engineers sent tapes of their memories, recorded on devices now quaint but still resonant. A niece of one of the technicians brought in a box of letters that contained a single apologetic line about a father who had missed a birthday because he had been called to the shop. Each fragment sharpened the tension between technique and consequence. The engine became not merely an object, but the center of a web. Love, duty, error, pride, and the mundane courage of daily repair. Rory found his own practice changed by that work. He began meetings not by fixing deadlines or bullet points, but by asking, plainly, who would bear the outcomes of the decisions on the table. He raised questions that once would have seemed sentimental. Who will answer the families if something goes wrong? Who will know when to slow down? Those questions, once posed with the insistent clarity of Brackett's "listen," reframed budgets and schedules. They did not always win. Institutional inertia is stubborn. But they were present now, lodged like a suggestion that one could not fully ignore. On a rain-thinned evening, after the new exhibit opened, Rory returned to the museum alone. The lights made the engine's cooling fins gleam. Visitors had gone hours before. He stood for a long time, and then sat on a bench facing the display case where the log rested, small beneath its protective glass. He traced, with the memory of a fingertip against the pane, the script that had become a last instruction for him and for others. He thought of the men and women whose initials peppered the margins. He thought of the child scribble. He thought of the thin smile in Brackett's face when he had said, "the care," and the listening. Those words had not been a panacea. They were a practice. In the days to come, Rory would teach them at the university, argue for them in committees, and insist on them in the noisy world of deadlines. He would find resistance. He would, too, find allies. Out in the plaza, above the museum's glass and stone, the sky remained a plane of shifting light. Planes traced their modern lines, indifferent to the older engines below. The polished fins and the yellowed log both occupied their separate archives of meaning. What moved between them was not a single verdict, but an ongoing conversation about workmanship and consequence, about small acts and their far-reaching echoes, about the faces that always, inevitably, follow a measurement. Rory rose from the bench, and for a moment he allowed himself to imagine a future he did not yet know how to build. A community where listening was a standard as palpable as a torque wrench, where families were accounted for not as an afterthought, but as part of engineering. He folded his coat over his arm, turned the key of the museum doors, and walked out into the night with the log sentence in his pocket like a coin. On his way home, he stopped at a small workshop that had once belonged to one of Brackett's collaborators. Light spilled from its windows, and inside, an apprentice was learning to file a valve seat by hand. Rory paused, watched the apprentice's careful strokes, and smiled. The work went on: craft, critique, repair, and with it, the responsibility of those who made things. He thought of the faces again, and of the ways memory moves from ledger to hand. He kept walking until the city sounds thinned, until the engine story folded into other lives and other engines. In that folding, there was no final answer, only the ongoing necessity of measurement, care, and remembrance. He understood, as he had not before, that a single folded page in a yellowing log could tilt conversation, insist upon an ethic, and outlast the maker. And somewhere, in a drawer or in a case or in the quiet mind of an apprentice, the rule persisted: measure with care. Remember the faces.